Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. Hello, my name is Carol Cozio, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of the series. Monica Dragoz and I co-created this program. Today, we're going to have a panel discussion about rites of passage, and Monica is going to lead us in the conversation with our panel guests. Monica, the airwaves are yours.
Hi there. So, just introducing myself from what is referred to as Golden, British Columbia, but the traditional and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and Secwepemc First Nations. I'm going to introduce our guests today, and they are from Wild Mountain Retreats, conducting wilderness rites of passage. And that's going to be our topic today. And so with us, we have Praveen Montana, and using he, him pronouns. And Praveen coaches, mentors, and advises leaders in startups, nonprofits, and community outreach programs in the principle of conscious leadership and social impact. He has been a nature-based rite of passage guide for over a dozen years and is currently focused on supporting and mentoring community and BIPOC leaders in this domain. Breen Cardinal, using they, them pronouns, is an Indigenous two-spirit guide and therapist from Treaty 8 territory in Alberta. In addition to their rites of passage work, they currently serve as a somatic trauma therapist for queer and low-income communities. And Rue Wharton, using they, them pronouns, has over 25 years as a rites of passage guide and therapist, and founded Wild Mountain Retreats and offers programs, trainings, and mentoring through Wild Mountain and the School of Lost Borders. Rue is dedicated to uplifting queer, trans, and BIPOC guides into leadership for accessible nature-based programs. So thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful. I think I shared this quote in email, but I thought it would be good to share again. And it comes from someone from the School of Lost Borders in a newsletter that they sent out. We know that rites of passage are not simply a thing of the past to remember. They are here and now as living, breathing acts of initiation and incorporation that are calling us forth into right relationship with the changing world. What is no longer the whole story. So I think that Carol and I thought it would be good to start even by maybe just having you speak to what is a rite of passage, like how you might describe that or define that, particularly, I guess, in our time of living, or in terms of how you approach guiding those important ceremonies for people. So whoever wants to start, please feel free.
I think maybe that's one you could start with, and we'll follow up and add out from there. Yeah.
Sorry, Praveen. Did you say that you had wanted me to start?
Either of you, yeah. Whoever would like to.
Can I have the question one more time, Monica?
Sure. I think we're just wanting to acknowledge that there could be people here who aren't entirely clear on what a rite of passage is, or a nature-based or wilderness-based rites of passage is. So we thought we would just start with, what is it? What does it look like? How would you describe it? What's the purpose, maybe even?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, and that it can look like so many different things. I think that it's an initiation. An initiation and rites of passage are happening to us in our lives all of the time. But what the work that we do is honoring those initiations and life transitions in a held ceremonial container. that supports the individual in understanding, digesting, and metabolizing the changes that are happening within their body and bringing them into like deeper connection to themselves and the space around them.
Thank you, Breen. Love that. Also want to say one of the pieces is a lot around identity. When someone's transitioning from a rite of passage, they're moving maybe from one identity to a next, or honoring and celebrating their identity. So in the work we find it's a lot about belonging. And so being seen in identities and the wholeness of who we are, as well as belonging. And that's what we've really appreciated on what's happening at the Affinity space at Wild Mountain, is it's making more space for belonging in wilderness programs that have been primarily for white, middle class to upper class folks. So we're really trying to make more access and having affinity space for queer and trans community and BIPOC community, so people can show up in ways that really serve the whole. And that's what it's about, is really serving the whole.
Yeah, I'll add a piece here too. So if we are or were in a more traditional tribal or village context, there would be very specific ceremonies to mark rites of passage, be that from, say, what might consider an adolescent stage to more an adult stage of life, or a new chapter of life, or into elderhood, for example. Because of the times we are in now, part of particularly what we've been doing while Mountain, going back to school, Lost Borders, is helping people find their way based on their lineage, their ancestry, and their own identity, for their own rite of passage. So we don't prescribe a whole lot. We give some bare bones, which we can touch on later, and really help people find their ceremony. But the important thing is, it's still a communal process. It's still a collective seeing and supportive process with everyone. And that's where the belonging comes in, is your unique individual self, including the way you want to mark your rite of passage, is really essential and welcome. And we're all going to collectively support and hold it. If each of us shows up with our own individual identity and own individual way to mark this, while supporting each other collectively as well too. So it has that balance. In that way, it feels really a response and evolution of, say, a more traditional rite of passage, which is much more a fixed, prescribed thing that everybody follows exactly.
Thank you for that. I almost don't know how to ask this question, but I'm sort of feeling compelled to. And so I'll ask it something like, just how important is, I guess, the land or the sort of more than human world in your view in these rites of passage?
I would say extremely important. One of the most important things is the relationship that we are having with land. That's like our, our basis, our secure attachment that's holding us through the ceremony, that is like creating the container, that is speaking to us. And that, I think, is maybe like the key ingredient of what is initiating us.
Yeah. And I would say historically, all rites of passages were completely based on relationship to ancestor spirit world, as well as connection to land and people's belonging in land, because without that relationship, a society would die inherently. It wouldn't survive. And so that connection was essential and inherent. These days, obviously, rites of passage, when we think about it in terms of modern mainstream American society, North American society, for example, it tends to be a little bit more rote. It tends to not have that connection anymore. That connection has been severed, and it tends to be more a celebration or a gathering, and cheering. Maybe there's costumes and dresses worn, in some way to kind of mark it. And the land component, culture component tends to be missing, particularly in terms of the culture and community which has come to this country as immigrants, especially. where that land connection has been severed. And so much of now, I think, restoring what it's like to reconnect to a land, which is how it's always been, and the larger ecosystem, the more than human world, and also bringing back the spirit world and ancestral realm. Like, what is that connection? What is that relationship? Once more. And of course, there's still many societies across the world where that has not been severed. So for example, if one were to go into a village in Africa and experience a rite of passage ceremony, the ancestral will is built into it. There's no ceremony without that kind of connection. So that's something that, especially for us here in this era, where that lineage or that line of practice has been broken, to reestablish that for ourselves. So it feels essential because it gives a much richer field of holding that I think that we've lost. And so I think about even some of the rites of passage I've been through in my culture as an Indian born in India. There was a quality of rootedness to it. And so what I discovered by actually re-engaging back with land and nature-based ceremony, I'm like, oh, now this makes sense. It doesn't feel like something I just follow that's kind of empty. And then people celebrate. And the next day I'm not transformed by the experience. It's nice. I'm seen, and it's nice to be with my people with it, but I actually don't feel different the next day necessarily. I'm supposed to, but I don't. But in the larger ceremonial context of the land, the ecosystem, of nature, ancestors, suddenly I can feel myself across this multi-thousand year lineage of where I am now and what's being marked.
Just to what you've shared there, Praveen, I'm wondering about thoughts that any of you might have about engaging in rites of passage on lands that are not one's ancestral lands, and the challenges that might be inherent in that, and also maybe the things to consider in terms of whose ancestral land that actually is and showing respect for that.
Mm.
We're all waiting on each other. I got lots to say, but somebody else jump in. Yeah. Yeah.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think there's a lot there, obviously. One is just really going to the land to listen, going to the land to hear the stories that have happened on the land, and a lot of them are difficult. And that's with the land and the people that are indigenous to the land. To also reach out and try to build relationships if possible with the indigenous people from that area. But for me, I feel like personally, there's a tenderness in walking the land, a humility, a place to deal with my own experience of being an oppressor or oppressed, and to actually feel into that. And the land reflects that, and the land holds it. The land also, from my experience, really wants the ceremony, wants people to come to the land. I feel like it celebrates it. It's like Pedro, who's a guide at the school, was in a clear-cut area during a ceremony recently. And this area had been totally clear-cut, and he was realizing that the trees were like feeling him out. Like, why are you here? You know, what is your intention for being here? And within 4 days, he started to feel from the land like, wow, you're here for something different. And so really feeling into that also with relationship with indigenous communities, where you're from, or where you're on. And it's really important part of this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think to add off of that, because all of that was really wonderful, Rue, like asking permission of the land and giving offering to the land of like, does this land want us to be able to have this ceremony here? And to be open to the fact that the answer might be no, and that that is okay. I think the most important thing in being a settler or a colonizer on indigenous land, trying to practice ceremony, is also to be in accountability of what that means as you're entering into relationship with stolen land, and to hold that with a lot of care.
Hoping it's okay to backtrack a little bit. I actually meant to ask to start as well if any or each of you have some things that you would be okay with sharing about how you came to your own engagement with rites of passage and even your decision to eventually guide rites of passage. It's whatever feels comfortable or okay to share here in this space.
I'll share. I came to Rites of Passage because I hit a wall of desperation in my life. And so my experience is I'm an immigrant. I'm from India. I grew up in Singapore. And so I come from, a colonized modern context, right? Went through all the systems of what it means to be successful in this world, education, getting a good job, so on and so forth. I also come from a traditional background as an Indian, so I also had an arranged marriage young in my life, in my early 20s. And so I hit this point in my early 30s where I could no longer get out of bed. And I started to look at my life, and I noticed my traditional life as an Indian, which I tried to fulfill, and then the modern life as an immigrant in America that I tried to fulfill. Both of them were not actually of my choosing. They were society's values. There were stuff that my culture had passed on to me, and there were also stuff that I assimilated and adapted to in terms of America, of how to be successful as an immigrant, right? The so-called American dream. And it would have been great if it worked. I would have continued on, and I wouldn't be here right now, but it wasn't working for me. And I couldn't figure out why. And I remember a conversation with my therapist. He was going to put me on depression medication, and I could tell it was not a chemical issue. It was a context issue. My life wasn't true to myself. Something was really, really off on a soul level. And so from there, I eventually stumbled on to rites of passage and nature-based ceremonies, in this case, starting with the School Lost Borders. And something about it just clicked as a process. It was very hard for me to describe why. Most people don't end up in this path when they hit a wall, right? It's not something that most people do, but for me, it called me. And when I did my first nature-based ceremony, like it all finally made sense. Like I found a way to connect back to my culture in a way that felt true to me versus some kind of social programming I was supposed to follow that didn't actually feel true to me. And I started to find myself disengaged from a way of living in the US as an immigrant of what success meant. And I started to find my own way forward that felt more meaningful to me and more true. And so that's how I landed into all of this. And it's been transformative. I would say my original time on the land doing a rites of passage was the most significant event of my life for me personally, because it changed the entire trajectory of my life from that point onwards and how I engage. And then I actually swung the pendulum so far that I found myself just hating mainstream society at one point and refusing to engage with consumerism, capitalism, all of that. And that was, for me at least, also completely off balance because I basically stopped engaging with our times and our systems. And so I find myself coming back again, finding what is that midpoint, that integration point that can move us forward. And so that continues to be my journey right now.
Making a space if either will bring to share, but if you don't, you can absolutely move on to another question.
Yeah, I would be very happy to share. In some ways, it's a long and winding tale, and in some ways, maybe not. I was really, really lucky to be able to be raised within my traditional culture, as my father, Don Cardinal, was a medicine man, elder, teacher, and spiritual leader within our community. So I had the privilege of being able to be, like, in my early life, steeped in a traditional Indigenous way of being. And then my father passed away when I was 11, and I went to live with my white mother in New York on Long Island, which is a very, if anyone has ever been there, very different vibe. And for me, rediscovering rites of passage was a way of me, like, being able to come home, to re-understand this, like, important and crucial and full part of my life that had felt asleep for a really, really long time. And I think for me, similar to what I've heard Praveen share, had been a way of, like, healing grief and loss and trauma, and in terms of, like, coming to guide it, thinking about how, from my perspective, as I think about, like, my community, um, a way of healing for my people, but I also think it's, like, greater than that, a way of healing for the people, because we've all suffered trauma and we've all suffered loss as a result of living in a capitalist and colonial culture.
It's great to hear you both. I'll just throw in a little piece of when I was young. I was in high school, and my high school social worker, who was Indigenous, got me involved in understanding more about this kind of work and rites of passage work. And fortunately, I was able to find the School of Lost Borders, and I came to a program when I was 21, and it just touched me in such a deep way. And I think the biggest pieces that touched me were the community element, having elders and multi-generational people together to see me into my initiation into adulthood. And also just being seen and heard and having this connection with the land in a way that felt much more whole. And I came from cities, so I didn't actually have much connection to the land at that time. And it got me into this work. And I'll say some of the big pieces now, over 25 years of being involved in this work personally, because we go out and do our ceremonies every year, is just exploring my own gender identity. Sexual orientation have been such a big part of this work for me, which also led into the queer quest that we started. So I don't think I would be where I am if it wasn't for the work and the people that have come. And yeah, it's just deeply touched my life.
Thanks for all that sharing. I think, Irene, you had made reference to, of course, that there have been lots of people who've been excluded from being connected to land, and that's been a privilege kind of held by white folks. And I think that a lot of us in our circles here in eco-psychology have been working on educating ourselves as to how that's happened and why that's the case. And so I'm wondering what has been important in the work of guiding as far as making these rites of passage inclusive for diverse communities. What things have you had to implement or do in order to bring that about, to support that queer communities and BIPOC communities have this access to these ceremonies and that fuller connection to land? Can't hear you, Praveen.
Yeah, I think the first thing is just offering this. Like if you were to do, for example, a Google search, you won't find a lot of options. You might not find very much at all. I'd be curious what's out there now. As we were offering this work, we realized there was so little. Most of, as far as general public accessible rites of passage work goes, is almost all white majority. And so that's a movement which was much needed, that goes back to probably the 60s onwards, right? School Lost Borders has been at the forefront of it as well too. And it's been essential. And, if you talk to most general public, maybe they're familiar with, like, say, Bill Plotkin's work or so on and so forth. So there's some awareness out there about this, including in the circles I hang out with in the mainstream, but leaders and so on. But as far as what one might call more marginalized groups in terms of belonging, there's very little that's out there, relatively speaking, in this context. And so our intention was just to first offer it. And, Rue's been offering, particularly with queer and trans folk. It's been going quite a number of years. And then with the BIPOC communities in the last couple of years. Because the reality is, and I'll speak for BIPOC population, the reality is for many of us, we don't have an intact community that is holding this for us at this moment, regardless of whatever our background is, whether we're coming in as immigrants or, descendant of people who were brought in here enslaved, or indigenous that have been displaced or experienced genocide, whatever, or variations. And we've also had people come in who are mixed race, where they have oppressor and oppressed in their system, and both are part of the ancestry, and they're working that out. Where do they go? And so to be honest, this started originally as an experiment. Like, let's offer this and see what unfolds, because we don't know, except we know that it's not being commonly offered. And we're continuing to learn at this. I can say for myself personally, there's probably 2 times in my entire life where I felt a true sense of belonging. And one of them was in the first offering of the BIPOC container. I didn't realize how much of a difference it was to be in a container where everyone was identified as non-white, and everybody brought their own lineage and ancestry and ceremony. And even those who were mixed race, where there were nuances in it, we could all drop in terms of what is the link to our ancestry that we can connect to. And in a lot of ways, it feels like the story of North America, because there was a richness there that I wouldn't have experienced even if I was just hanging directly with my own people. So, for example, I'm from India. I can go back to India. There's over 1 billion Indians now on the planet. So it's not a lack of access to the culture necessarily, but it to me was more like in these times and in this place that I live in right now. How do we all connect, and how do we all support each other? And for myself too, it took me a whole next level in terms of what is it like to release a colonized mind or to de-assimilate from white mainstream culture. In a way, I understood it and I practiced the principles of it, but I didn't really get it until I was in a BIPOC container, because it was almost like my whole nervous system relaxed, and then it just became automatic. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to get super activist about it. I didn't have to make anyone wrong, including white culture. I could just drop into it organically and naturally for myself, and really explore that and take it out into the land, take it out into ceremony and prayer, and then connect much deeper as well to what had happened to the area and those who had come before. And so it just allowed for all of that to unfold. And the part I didn't expect was the variety and richness of people's backgrounds and cultures, and what they've been through. Sometimes some people held multitudes in them because of multiple cultures, in terms of the ancestry. What I didn't expect was that could come together so harmoniously and actually create a much deeper, richer field that could be held. And so that has been really transformative. And so part of this work, we offer it free. There's a scholarship basis. You pay a minimal amount. We really want to make it a giveaway. What I didn't expect as a guide was how much it would change me, to be in these containers. And I don't know where else to find it so far. I have not seen it.
You're really speaking to that importance of that dedicated container space where you don't have to be, just that space for BIPOC and other folks, right?
Yeah, and I just want to highlight the importance of affinity space in general, and how much that has changed this work. When I started this work in the late 90s, I guess, at the School of Lost Borders, we started the first women's fast at the time, and that was controversial, actually. So like that's just really interesting to think where we've come from that to then offering the Queer Quest, which has now been 12 years. That was controversial too when we started, and people didn't even understand. Some people in the work didn't even understand what LGBT meant. So just to see like the span, and it's just beautiful. And what we're really noticing, I'll speak to the queer programs in particular, because we have now been doing them for 12 years, and we've had, well, we're doing BIPOC and queer affinity space trainings as well. Is that what we're noticing now is there's more queer folks and trans folks coming to just open programs that we offer apart from the affinity space, because they've had experience in affinity space and they're feeling a container at Wild Mountain. And now in our open programs, we have a lot more gender identities and in that program, and it actually serves the whole so much more. And people will come and say, wow, I had no idea when I was coming to this program. We had a young man in a recent program who wanted to do a rite of passage into manhood, and he was going to switch back to a men's fast program. But he stayed with this open program, and probably more than 50% of the group was queer, trans, intersex. And he said like he wouldn't have been able to enter manhood without that. And that's the gifts we bring each other. And what's missing, you know, when we're a majority white space, we're missing a huge amount. So I'm excited about what's coming, you know, and my hope is that, you know, after enough affinity space, but it's going to take a while. And for some folks, it may always be affinity space. We can also come together and gain these gifts of people who have been marginalized from these experiences.
Well, thanks so much for addressing that, Melanie. It's so great to hear about all of that. Maybe gonna just ask one or two more questions and then open it up to the group here. I'm wondering how you feel your approach to guiding reflects and maintains respect for the protected practices or the like of Indigenous cultures. Those more culture specific practices. I think you mentioned that, you know, there isn't a strong format that you provide, and it is more of a container and affinity spaces and things like that. And I think it was also mentioned, yeah, maybe we could talk about form a bit in that general way here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first, I think it's an ongoing discovery. So there's definitely aspects of the ceremony as we inherited that, in my perspective, there's been appropriation. Yeah. Not huge amounts, like we're not doing, like, for example, like traditional Inflecha Vision Quest by any means at all. But there's still aspects I know with the ceremony around using smudge bowls, around the directions, around the medicine wheel, aspects of it, but we've really looked at and go, okay, if we remove this, and because it has a history of appropriation, and we find something else, can the ceremony be as potent? Can we find a new way? And can we find a different way forward? And so that's been an ongoing discovery, and really looking at everything that we could strip to create really more of a full just structure for rite of passage, and then what do we add back in our way. And so I want to say that first, so that we don't come out here looking squeaky clean and claiming that there's none. I think that would be dishonest. I think what we can say is we're looking to find a new way forward, and one of the ways that we found is everybody bring their practices, you know, essentially, which for example, in a multicultural context there's a lot of variety that comes up, and so we will have people because they have the indigenous background where we will have drum and singing because they bring it, and we will join together with them as a group because they're bringing their way. And then others, such as myself, will bring something from my lineage as a Hindu into the practice. And so there is still the concept of radical inclusivity, like please bring your culture and heritage. We're not going to tell you what this process is. And if there is indigenous background and a way, we'll incorporate it into the ceremony because that honors your lineage and your way. So that's where we have mostly settled at this point. That being said, the bare bones of the ceremony and rite of passage is still there. How do we mark a severance, crossover threshold, and into a new place? How do we welcome you back and support you with storytelling and mirroring counsel, as we call it? And so there's still aspects that are there. Some of these are, I would say, more particular to what we call North America, and some of them are just universal as a rite of passage across all cultures. So it's an ongoing discovery. I would say that's probably the best we have now, and we keep finding what's emerging and letting the ceremony inform us in that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts too, including you, Bree, and how that was like for you and what you noticed, from your experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for some context, as a I was a participant in the first year of the BIPOC guide training. And I think there are aspects of the ceremony traditionally that have indigenous inspiration for North America, things that mirror different pieces of the culture. But I also think, just to say, Praveen, echo what you're speaking to, of like, we all carry teachings and some form of like indigeneity to some land somewhere, even if it's not here. And to be able to bring that, to honor the ancestors, your ancestors in that way, whether that is Indian from India or from Africa, or I think even Celtic paganism, is like a gift to the space.
You. And also just want to say, one of the things that we're also conscious of is indigenous erasure. It's not that we're stripping everything away and making it our own and owning it either. Because that's important, I feel like, as we all navigate cultural appropriation. So it's really important to acknowledge the teachers that have led to this work, and we do that in our work. And the times are different. In the 1970s, there were, and your father, Breen, was one of the teachers that was going around Europe too, and teaching Europeans of European descent indigenous spiritual practices. So there is that history, and now we're in this different time. And how do we, we're constantly in question. This is a process that will not probably end in my lifetime, but with respect and relationship and accountability. And Breen, I love what you said too about it's important for white folks too to also go back to your ancestry. And we're thinking of, actually, I don't know if it's going to happen anytime soon, but offering some programs in Scotland for people with Scottish descent, where you can go back and really connect to the land there and the practices that have been lost, and that we all around the world have these practices and connection to land that it's important to honor, and it doesn't have to look a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry, a little more of like, I'm like, oh yeah, that like really sparked something for me. I think there is an important thing in rites of passage that, as I think we speak about decolonization a lot, but it's also really important to speak about like re-indigenizing rites of passage work, and that can be done in a way that is not culturally appropriative. And that's really important, because that's also part of like the spirit of the work and the spirit of the ceremony. Yeah. And that is done like through relationship. I think about when settlers first came to Canada, they were invited to attend Indigenous ceremony, and that there is like a long history of relationship there. Things went sour, obviously, but like, where can that relationship still live and breathe in the work?
Well, I really appreciate all of you addressing that question and answering that, because I think here in this community we've had, and on our Facebook page, we've had some, Carol uses some spicy discussions about sometimes, in a way, even if it's like, how okay is it to be engaging in rites of passage, as it were, in that format, in that, even that general format of severance, threshold, you know. So I just really want to thank you for that. And I think that with the time remaining, I definitely want to start opening it up to other people for comments, their comments and questions as well. So Carol, I don't know if we have any hands up, or if anyone would like to stick a hand up now.
Does anybody want to drop a question in the chat or unmute and just ask our panel a question?
Anne?
Hi, thank you very much. That was really great, and a lot of the questions I came with have been answered or have sparked new questions, which is fantastic. I'm just simply wondering how people find you and your program, and it's of interest. That question is of interest to me in part because you have said how few other similar programs are out there. So I'm wondering how participants find you, or how you reach out, if you do reach out.
I can speak to that. At this point, we're a really small organization, grassroots. We're mostly all volunteering our time to make this all happen. So we don't have like a marketing campaign or anything like that, just put it out there. But this work has always been really relational. And so we reach out through relationship and word of mouth. And that's pretty much how everyone comes. That may change over time. We do have a website too, that some people do find the work on the website just randomly and are like, wow, I've never seen something that welcomes me in that way. Yeah, and that's really important. So to be continued, but yeah, if that answers your question.
Yeah, in addition to Wild Mountain Retreats, which is the organization where we run and facilitate this, our hope is actually that the work goes beyond what we offer. So, for example, with the BIPOC program, our focus has been on supporting other guides to bring their ceremony and their land-based rites of passage work out to whoever their people are, their communities. So our hope is, once there's enough of that it spreads from there. And so we're not a bottleneck in terms of supporting this work at all.
Other questions and comments?
Thank you.
Yeah, this is just a comment. So thank you, Breen, Andrew, and Praveen. And thank you all for such a uplifting and positive presentation. I really appreciate that. And I really heard what you said, Rue. You said it's all about respect, relationship, and accountability. And I'm really hearing it to the land, to our ancestors, and to each other. And I just really thank you.
I have one question, having been a participant in a number of land time things, rites of passage iterations. One of the things I struggled with is I had a very profound experience with the group and with the community. And then it was back to Silly Bugger Society, lunch bag letdown. And it was almost depressing because I saw what could be and then what was. And one of the things I wonder is, how do you help people bridge back into Silly Bugger Society? Oh my God, please say there is.
Yeah, I could jump in. I was waiting, I think, on you if you'd like to answer, but I'll jump in. This is, I would say, the missing piece for most rites of passage programs offered to the general public, regardless of the context, whether it's white majority or not, or a particular affinity group. And I'm with you on this, Carol. That has really bothered me, actually. It's almost like, okay, here, have this beautiful experience, and there you go, off you go. Good luck back in your life. Now figure out some way to integrate that and go transform or support the society around you. You have everything you need. Blessings. Bye. You know, I'm exaggerating slightly for dramatic effect, but it almost had some of that quality, and you were on your own from there to figure it out. And so we have really like, okay, this doesn't work. So how can we create an ongoing community that actually supports people? There's the obvious ways, like we'll have WhatsApp threads. We have integration calls for the next year, usually multiple calls to support people. But more importantly, it's almost like we start to invite people into a larger community. For example, in Wild Mountain, there's a larger community of Wild Mountain where people can regather up and come together. We really encourage people who've gone through and they were invited to Passage, either as a participant or as a guide in training, to come back to support and to assist and re-plug in back to the community. And our intentions, particularly for me and Rue as guides, is eventually they actually take over and run the programs, whoever is interested in this as well, to feel called to this work. And then people want to bring it back into their communities as well too. We're happy to hop on a call with them and talk through how it's going, how we can support them. And so we're really trying to extend as much as possible in terms of staying in touch and having them be plugged into a larger community as well too that could support them in this process. And also it's evolving. There's no blueprint on how to do this because my experience is similar. It has not been done that much with the general public programs. And it feels really, really important that that's there. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck getting that bridge built.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Monica, you're not unmute, Monica.
Thanks. There's a question from Peggy that I'd like to get to. She put it in the chat, so maybe I'll read it. So great to hear that there is a new emphasis on specific culture, i.e. rites of passage work for Scots, Gaelic folks. Do you see in the future more emphasis on cultural specificity in general, which can be very hard work, versus your universality? What is in the interest level in your spaces for reviving specific cultural traditions, or is that work too daunting?
I can try to answer this. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, I mean, we only have a limited amount of capacity, obviously, at Wild Mountain, but as Praveen said, we're really hoping that people that come to the trainings can take the work elsewhere. And yes, to both. I feel like that's really what I've learned from the last 12 years of the Queer Quest is the importance of affinity space. But also we've also sat with, do we create trans affinity space? Do we create queer, trans, BIPOC affinity space? So it's getting more and more specific. And we are moving into some of those realms, but there's something lost. One thing we know is like in the queer programs, if there was a trans affinity space, maybe there'd be less trans people, but that's because it's needed. So holding both, and yeah, it's all unfolding, and definitely like very excited about, the European ancestral recovery work too. And I know a lot of people and organizations are doing more of that. So it's definitely beyond what we can hold, but hopefully this continues to happen. I would recommend an organization called White Awake that does work with white folks who are going back into ancestral recovery work, and how that plays into social justice, how we show up in the world, and all of that as one resource. And there's many out there.
Thank you. Getting close to our time, but if someone has a quick question or comment and fit that in, or